When talking about how the public perceived Titanic before the sinking, it's important to note that Titanic was built alongside her sister ship, Olympic. Olympic was the first to be completed and set sail, so she got most of the attention. Titanic was also a big deal, but she wasn't quite the center of attention that Olympic was. In fact, most photographs that people claim are of Titanic are actually of Olympic. There's not even a single photo of Titanic's grand staircase, that's all Olympic. It wouldn't be until after the morning of April 15th that the Titanic would really grab the world's attention by storm. It's important to note that news of the Titanic sinking reached land while the ship was sinking. Titanic's wireless operator was communicating with several ships throughout the night, calling for help. Wireless communication back then relied on Morse code, so wireless operators had to stick to the gist of their messages. Because of this, when news of the sinking reached land, details were pretty scarce. In spite of this, publishers were already eager to get the story out. One of the earliest newspaper publishings about the event is dated April 15th, which is the same day Titanic sank. Because it was written in such haste, the headline falsely claims that no lives were lost. So right from the get-go, misconceptions were spreading about the Titanic like wildfire. Even worse was intentional libel against J. Bruce Ismay from newspaper publishers under the thumb of William Randolph Hearst. Hearst was the most influential man in America's newspaper industry and had a falling out with Ismay some 20 years before the disaster. Because of this, Hearst had his publishers literally make up stories about Ismay just to make him look bad. These attacks against Ismay still influence how people see him to this day. In reality, Ismay volunteered to assist with the evacuation efforts on the Titanic, and only got into one of the last lifeboats to leave the ship once everyone else waiting on the boat had already boarded it. Some other rumors about Ismay that are untrue are him ordering Captain Smith to have the ship going full speed, and him reducing the number of lifeboats on board. Titanic was not the fastest ship in the world, nor was she even going full speed during her voyage. And early deck plans of Olympic and Titanic actually depict there being fewer lifeboats originally. However, the haste didn't stop there. As the rescue ship Carpathia was heading to New York with survivors, film producer Jules Brulator supposedly sent a camera crew to film her arrival. This footage of the Carpathia, intercut with footage of Olympic, was used in a newsreel about the Titanic which played in theaters. The newsreel footage was so popular that Brulator decided to make the first ever film dramatization about the disaster, which was titled Saved from Titanic, and came out in May of 1912, a mere month after the sinking. 1912 actually saw two films made about the Titanic. The first of these was Saved from Titanic. Unfortunately, every copy of Saved from Titanic was destroyed in a fire in 1914. What we know about the film is that it famously starred Dorothy Gibson, who is an actress that was actually aboard the Titanic when it sank. Funny enough, Gibson and Brulator worked for the same film company, the Eclair Film Company, which provided Brulator the unique opportunity of having the film star a genuine survivor of the disaster. The film was only 10 minutes long and was told in flashback. It started with Gibson arriving in New York where she meets with her parents and her fiancé. She then tells him about the disaster, and the film would then cut to a rough recreation of the events, likely using miniatures. One review of the film praised it for its visual effects, and another criticized it for commercializing the disaster, especially so soon after it happened. The next film to be made about the disaster, In Night and Ice, would come out in August of 1912 and be made in Germany. The film was about half an hour long, which was 3 times longer than the average movie back then, so we're already seeing unprecedented levels of effort being put into dramatizations about the Titanic. The film mainly focuses on Titanic's captain and wireless operator during the sinking. It greatly exaggerates the events that took place and is only accurate in a very broad sense of the word. The film was mostly shot aboard the SS Kaiserin Auguste Victoria, and so there's not a great deal of effort to represent the ship accurately. Interestingly, the film features a representation of Titanic's Parisian Café, which wouldn't be featured in another film until James Cameron's 1997 film. The film also shows the boiler crew working below decks, which I don't think is something people were particularly accustomed to seeing back in 1912, although this is a trend that would continue in all future film adaptations of the disaster. What these early films have in common is that they both painted a very broad picture of the disaster. For instance, In Night and Ice implies that the wireless operator Jack Phillips went down with the ship. In reality, Phillips made it off the ship but died later in the night due to the extreme temperatures. The film also shows Captain Smith dragging a stranded passenger to a lifeboat before drowning. I can't really fault these films too much for these sorts of inaccuracies, since this was an era where film technology was very limited. Sound in films wasn't a thing back then, and film itself was expensive, so movies had to be kept pretty short. There was also just less availability to information back in 1912 compared to today. The filmmakers likely had to rely mostly on what was published in newspapers, and we've already seen how catastrophically inaccurate some of the newspapers about the disaster were. Oddly enough, despite the first two film dramatizations about the Titanic coming out mere months apart, the next Titanic-related film wouldn't be made until 17 years later. In 1929, the film Atlantic was released, supposedly based on a play titled The Berg. In its final form, the ship featured in the film is technically a fictional one, but it was originally supposed to be the Titanic. The name was changed due to a lawsuit made against the film by the White Star Line, which was still around at the time. Furthermore, British censors weren't too thrilled about movies being made about the Titanic either. This probably explains why there is such a large gap in Titanic dramatizations after In Night and Ice. In any case, the Titanic influences are still very clear in the final film. The ship is described as unsinkable before striking an iceberg and sinking over the course of 3 hours. Panic ensues on deck, which is reminiscent of the panic that took place on Titanic during the sinking. Granted, the film really likes to exaggerate the panic. Despite it technically not really being a Titanic film, it's still worth talking about. It also marks the beginning of what I like to call the weird era of Titanic films, and this one isn't even the weirdest, that comes next. Atlantic was also one of the first movies to use sound, and boy do they make use of it.
You and I know the truth, and the knowledge is a great responsibility.
What makes the film really weird is that even though it was originally intended to be about the Titanic, it very clearly takes place in the 1920s. Like, look at this footage of the evacuation. This is very clearly a ship that's way after Titanic's time. The interior sets also don't resemble Titanic. There's a bar on board, which is something Titanic didn't have, and there's also a staircase featured in the film which is very similar to the staircase aboard the RMS Majestic, which was Olympic's adopted sister ship after World War I. And it's like, why? This is also the first Titanic film to feature actual characters with proper character development. The characters are all fictional, but there's an old couple that might loosely be based on the Strausses. That being said, there's some interesting cinematography featured in the film, which is reminiscent of several later Titanic films. The next film to be made about the Titanic is by far the weirdest from this era. In 1943, during World War II, Germany made yet another film about the disaster, except this time the intentions were very, very different. Because Germany was at war with Britain at the time, the film is basically a propaganda piece that uses the Titanic to portray the British in a bad light and villainize them. This is the first Titanic film to feature Bruce Ismay, and they do not miss a beat in continuing William Randolph Hearst's effort to paint Ismay as a villain. The film depicts Ismay, as well as most of the first-class men aboard the ship, as greedy, cowardly, narcissistic, and hateful toward women. However, the film still has its fair share of fictional characters as well. The main character, for instance, is a fictional German officer named Peterson. Peterson is depicted as a stoic character that stands up to Ismay's fictionalized cowardice. Unlike in previous films, instead of the sinking being the main source of conflict, here it just serves to further complicate already existing conflicts that are established prior to the sinking. At the beginning of the film, Ismay talks about how White Star Line's stock value is plummeting, and the success of the company relies on the success of Titanic. During the voyage, Ismay reveals a secret to the passengers that not only was Titanic the largest ship in the world, but also the fastest, and has broken the speed record for fastest vessel in the Atlantic.
Or so the Germans would have us believe.
Meanwhile, first-class passenger John Jacob Astor intends to buy up all of White Star Line stocks, essentially buying the company. Ismay orders the captain to have the ship going full speed at all times. Then, of course, the ship hits an iceberg and begins to sink. Astor perishes while Peterson and Ismay survive. The film ends with a court scene in which all charges against Ismay are dropped. This is probably the most blatantly inaccurate of any Titanic film. Aside from its disgustingly false portrayals of the actual people who are on board, it also doesn't portray the ship itself accurately. The sets are like 10% more accurate than those in Atlantic, and for some reason this film also depicts there being a bar aboard the ship for some reason. The film also features some very graphic depictions of the sinking. This is a notable contrast compared to Atlantic, which was a lot more tame in its visualizations of the flooding. The production and release of this film were nothing short of a tragic disaster. The film went over budget due to demand for extravagant sets and resources from the German Navy. When director Herbert Selpin expressed his disdain with how members of the Navy were treating the woman on set, he was arrested and killed. The ship used for the film, the Cap Arcona, would later sink in 1945, taking about 5,000 lives with her. The film was ultimately finished, but despite this, it was never released in Germany since people were already dealing with daily air raids, and the German government thought the film would just further upset people. The German government also didn't like Peterson refusing to obey Ismay's demands in the film, since the people of Germany were expected to obey orders without question. The film did get a release in German-occupied France, where it was generally well received. There was even a British cut of the film which was heavily edited to basically remove all of the anti-British propaganda. The next and final film in the weird era of Titanic movies is 1953's Titanic. This was the first Hollywood film about the disaster and was produced by 20th Century Fox, which later went on to produce James Cameron's film. This is the first Titanic film that I would describe as watchable. In fact, it was the first Titanic film to ever win an Oscar. Interestingly, to this day, it's the only Titanic film to win the Oscar for Best Screenplay, which is a category that Cameron's film wasn't nominated for. That being said, accuracy is still thrown out the window in this film. The main characters consist of a fictional family of 4, in which the father, Richard, is trying to reunite with his wife and children after his wife intends to take their kids to America and leave Richard behind. This is one of the easier Titanic films to follow regarding its plot because it's mostly just Richard trying to reconcile with his family, whereas the previous 2 films had like a dozen central characters to keep track of. Speaking of characters, this film barely tries to hide the era it was made in. Despite it taking place in 1912, the characters behave like it's the 1950s.
Where have you been? Locked up in some art gallery? Why, that's the hottest jig the kids do.
That aside, the film's depiction of the ship is also very inaccurate. There's one set that vaguely resembles the Grand Staircase, but that's it. And for some reason, this film also depicts there being a bar aboard the ship. I don't get it. Credit where credit is due, the film features a pretty faithful miniature of the ship, and this is the only Titanic film that features the ship listing to one side, which it did in real life. Interestingly, not only does this film contain a graphic depiction of the sinking, it's even more graphic than the last film. Survivors did report hearing explosions during the sinking, but I think this might be a bit much. The film didn't perform great at the box office, making back just a little over its budget of $1.8 million. Those that did go to see it seemed to like it, except for one film producer who was so disappointed in the film that he decided to produce one of his own. William McQuitty was a British film producer who actually witnessed the Titanic's launch. After his disappointment with 1953's Titanic, he wanted to produce a film that depicted the disaster as accurately as possible. The film would be based on the Walter Lord book A Night to Remember and share the same title. Unlike with previous depictions, A Night to Remember's filmmakers worked hard to recreate areas aboard the ship as accurately as they could. They referenced photographs, deck plans, testimonies told by survivors, pretty much any and all information that they could get their hands on. On top of that, they even brought on survivors of the disaster as consultants, including one of Titanic's officers, Joseph Boxall. This strive for accuracy is extremely apparent in the final product. Instead of sets looking nothing like the Titanic, suddenly we have extremely faithful recreations of some of Titanic's most well-known spaces. The Grand Staircase, the dining saloon, and the ship's first-class smoking lounge are all recreated very faithfully. This was also the first Titanic film to feature Thomas Andrews, one of Titanic's key designers. After A Night to Remember, Andrews would go on to become a key staple in most future depictions of the story. the weird era of Titanic films mostly used Titanic as a backdrop to tell largely fictionalized stories, but A Night to Remember was about the Titanic. To this day, it's considered by many to be the most accurate depiction of the night the ship sank, rivaling even most documentaries despite the ship not splitting in half. The ship sinking in one piece can be excused since the splitting wasn't confirmed until 1985, when the wreck of the Titanic was found. There's only a few inaccuracies that are worth noting. Because Second Officer Lightoller is the film's protagonist, he's given tasks that were done by other officers during the actual night of the sinking. The film probably idolizes Lightoller a little too much, given that, in reality, he refused to allow men on lifeboats even if there was room for them. I think it would have been more fitting for First Officer Murdoch to be the main character, as he saved the most lives. That aside, I think certain characters are portrayed as a little too calm during the sinking.
The weight of water in the bow is going to pull her down by the head. So you're going to get the 5th watertight compartment overflowing into the 6th into the 7th, and so on as she gets lower. It's a mathematical certainty.
There's not really any sense of urgency from Andrews here. In reality, one of the survivors described Andrews having a look of terror on his face during the early stages of the flooding. A Night to Remember was one of the most expensive British films at the time, with the production team building a large miniature of the ship, as well as 30 sets, some of which being designed to tilt. Unfortunately, the film didn't fare very well at the box office, failing to make back its budget. After the financial letdown between 1953's Titanic and A Night to Remember, I assume most movie studios saw depictions of the Titanic as box office poison, because after A Night to Remember, there would be yet another long gap in movies made about the Titanic. The next theatrically released film about the Titanic would be Raise the Titanic in 1980. Based on Clive Cussler's novel of the same name, the film would be greenlit and produced by Lou Grade in 1976. Because the novel was part of a larger series in the genre of spy and espionage, it was hoped that Raise the Titanic would launch a film series based on the books, akin to the James Bond films. Curiously, during Raise the Titanic's development, Lou Grade's brother, Bernard Delfont, greenlit a separate Titanic project titled SOS Titanic. SOS Titanic was a made-for-TV movie about the disaster which released in 1979, a year before Raise the Titanic. After a disastrous production process which involved the original slated director leaving the project, several rewrites, and the film going far over budget, Raise the Titanic was released on August 1st, 1980. Both the book and film heavily feature a plot of espionage in which an American spy, named Dirk Pitt, is racing against the Russians to find a rare mineral. It's believed that this mineral was on the Titanic when it sank. In a race to get to it before the Russians, Dirk and his team race the Titanic. The movie is largely considered to be subpar, with the exception of the scene where Titanic gets raised out of the water. This is easily one of the most iconic shots involving Titanic in cinema history. It's worth noting that the model designer and matte painter for the film was Ken Marshall, who's one of the leading authorities on Titanic to this day. Ken is most well known for his paintings of Titanic and Lusitania, many of which you've probably seen. Thanks to Ken's involvement, the model that gets raised out of the water is maybe the most accurate Titanic model seen in film. The same cannot be said for the interior sets, though. The film briefly shows the grand staircase, and it's, weird. Like, okay, so the staircase itself looks kind of accurate. There's the cherub. The clock carving looks accurate. But then there's these weird pillars and arches that weren't there, and just everything else is very wrong. Unfortunately, the film was a financial disaster. Although producer Lou Grade originally aimed for a budget of around $10 million, the budget ultimately rose to $40 million. To put that into perspective, The Empire Strikes Back, which came out the same year, cost $30 million to make. The film made back a grand total of $7 million. On top of that, Clive Cussler hated the film. The film only got 3 award nominations, all of which were for Raspberry Awards. 1 for Worst Picture, 1 for Worst Supporting Actor, and 1 for Worst Screenplay. Raise the Titanic likely solidified the idea that Titanic was box office poison, and there would be yet another large gap in time between Titanic projects. I'm not really sure why, but suddenly in the mid-1990s, there was a massive boom in Titanic media being produced. It's worth mentioning that, in 1985, the wreck of the Titanic had been found by Robert Ballard. Prior to finding the wreck, it was assumed that the wreck was in much better condition. The finding of the wreck is what confirmed that the ship had indeed split in half during the sinking. Now let's jump to 1995. There are 3 Titanic projects in the works. One is a TV miniseries about the Titanic, one is a video game, and one is James Cameron's film about the disaster. The miniseries, released in 1996, actually featured the first ever depiction of Titanic splitting in half, beating the video game by literally a single day. The video game, titled Titanic Adventure Out of Time, also released in 1996, was the first video game about the Titanic. Even though it doesn't fall under the category of film, it's worth a brief mention for its stunning attention to detail. In its depiction of the ship, Adventure Out of Time rivaled even James Cameron's film in regards to accuracy. This is thanks largely to the involvement of Bill Sauter, another lead authority on Titanic. If you want to play the game for yourself, it's available on Steam. Finally, that brings us to James Cameron's Titanic. Like with previous efforts, Titanic had a massive budget, all in a tremendous effort to depict the ship using miniatures, massive sets, and a gargantuan amount of water. Unlike previous efforts though, Titanic was not a financial failure. Instead, it was the highest grossing movie of all time for 12 years. So what did this film have that others didn't? Simple. James Cameron. By this point, James Cameron already had a history of making movies with huge budgets and even bigger box office returns. Titanic would be no exception, costing $200 million to make and becoming the first film to gross $1 billion. And then it grossed another $1 billion. This would be the first major Titanic film to be made after the discovery of the wreck, so naturally the wreck is featured quite prominently in the film. Going to the wreck for the first time impacted Cameron and made him not only want to do the ship justice, but also the passengers who lost their lives. In order to replicate the ship accurately, Cameron and his crew were given access to Harland and Wolff's archives, where they discovered plans that were thought to be lost. Cameron also brought on Ken Marshall as a historic consultant for the film. Cameron himself also did months of research on the ship, the passengers, and the events that took place during the voyage. Cameron spared little expense making the movie, having a nearly 1-to-1 scale replica of most of the ship's exteriors rebuilt over a massive tank of water, which it was designed to lower into. The final product is almost like an amalgamation or celebration of all of the Titanic films that came before it. However, A Night to Remember is easily the film's greatest influence. It features many of the same characters and even recreates many scenes from the film. It even has one of the cast members from A Night to Remember, that being Bernard Fox. So, how does this film fare as far as accuracy? Generally speaking, pretty good. Obviously the central characters are all fictional, but there's still plenty of non-fictional characters and events that are depicted. The film's sets are easily the most impressive aspect in this regard. They're not perfectly accurate, but they're pretty damn close. The film's depictions of the true events and people on board are also pretty accurate, with a few exceptions. For instance, the film still villainizes Bruce Ismay somewhat, featuring a scene where he convinces the captain to have the ship going full speed. A survivor, Elizabeth Lines, did overhear a conversation between Ismay and Smith in which they discussed Titanic's performance. However, Ismay did not push for Smith to light the last 4 boilers, which is how the discussion is depicted in the film. The film also depicts the character of William Murdoch in a surprisingly negative light. Murdoch was responsible for saving 330 of the 706 survivors, but the film depicts Murdoch accepting a bribe, which never really happened, and killing 2 passengers before shooting himself in the head. In reality, 2 shots were heard from Murdoch's general location during the late stages of the sinking, but that's all that's really known. Cameron took extreme liberties by depicting Murdoch killing passengers and then killing himself. It's just strange to depict arguably the biggest hero of the disaster in such a distasteful manner. Murdoch's descendants were so appalled by this depiction that they wrote to Cameron, who then publicly apologized for how he portrayed the character. That aside, the film liked to exaggerate the use of gates aboard the ship. There weren't nearly this many gates aboard Titanic, and to my knowledge, the crew didn't actively prevent third class from going up on deck. The main issue is that Titanic's lifeboats were located on the topmost first and second class decks. Third class were generally on the lower decks and had no immediate access to any lifeboats. By the way, you know the scene where everyone in the boiler room is trying to escape through the watertight doors? You actually wouldn't want to go through the watertight doors as they're closing. Each of the boiler rooms and the engine rooms had separate escape routes in the form of ladders, which were used in the case of an emergency. Let's say you're in boiler room 3, the room is flooding, and the watertight doors are all shut. Now what? Oh, silly me, there's a set of escape ladders right here. Those moments aside, the film depicts a lot of other events with a great deal of accuracy. Officer Lowe firing 3 shots from Lifeboat 14, Lifeboat 15 nearly lowering onto Lifeboat 13, and the crew manning the collapsible lifeboats as the boat deck floods are true-to-life events that are recreated very faithfully. The film was originally going to feature more true-to-life scenes of the wireless operators and the Californian, but these were cut for time. So why did this film do so well compared to previous efforts? To put it simply, James Cameron knows how to captivate an audience. He knows exactly what strings to pull to make a profound impact on people. On top of that, being both writer and director for the film, he's in complete control. So unlike Raise the Titanic, which had multiple directors and writers each doing their own thing, there was a singular, focused vision with Titanic. Cameron also knows how to fight against studio demands that undermine his vision. 20th Century Fox was extremely worried about how over budget the film was and wanted an hour of the film cut, to which Cameron responded, "If you want to cut my movie, you'll have to fire me. If you want to fire me, you'll have to kill me." Cameron's often been described as the scariest man in Hollywood. He's willing to fight tooth and nail to make his visions come true, and that he did. The final film is filled with stunning imagery, impressive set design, likable characters, an excellent score by James Horner, innovative visual effects, and an incredible attention to detail. Even greater than the film itself would be the impact it had on pop culture and the general public. Suddenly, the entire world was once again entranced by the story of the Titanic. Titanic's influence could be felt in many films over the next several years, such as Pearl Harbor, The Aviator, and even Peter Jackson's King Kong to an extent. There would even be a made-for-TV movie about the Britannic, Titanic's sister ship, in 2000. As far as Titanic in cinema, it seemed like there was nothing left to do, as Cameron's film had seemingly done it all. With film productions about the Titanic taking a back seat, the spotlight would be placed on community-made content about the Titanic. Throughout the 2000s, you had people making digital recreations of the Titanic wherever they could. Meanwhile, historians such as Ken Marshall, Bill Sauter, and Park Stevenson continued researching Titanic and brought light to several new findings along the way. With the advent of the internet and video game technology, combined with a massive community of Titanic enthusiasts, it would only be a matter of time before the next big Titanic project would emerge. In 2012, a startup consisting of said Titanic enthusiasts and modelers known as Vintage Digital Revival began working on a new Titanic video game called Titanic: Honor and Glory. The project has gained quite a lot of attention from the Titanic community over the years. The project has even received help from the likes of Ken Marshall and Bill Sauter. So far, the project has led to many new discoveries about the ship and has set a new benchmark for accuracy in depicting the ship, surpassing even the James Cameron film. It seems that the legacy of Titanic has found a new home outside of cinema, in the hands of a thriving and dedicated community of fans. Officer Peterson is so dedicated to the job, he doesn't just wear one uniform, no, he wears 2 uniforms, that's right.